आज के सत्र में 5 पैनलिस्ट रहेंगे जिनका परिचय मैं आपको देना चाहूंगी। अंजना संधीर। Anjana Sandeep has written 44 books. She edited 7 volumes of American Hindi diaspora literature. Sandeep wrote a book, Learn Hindi and Hindi Film Songs with CD. She translated 16 Gujarati books, including Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi's Gujarati poems, Aakh Aa Tanya Che, into Hindi. I hope I pronounced it right. हिंदी से इसका अनुवाद 17 भाषा भारतीय और 2 विदेशी भाषाओं में हुआ है। आप 1998 से विदेशी छात्रों को हिंदी पढ़ा रही हैं। आपको गुजरात साहित्य अकादमी गांधीनगर से हिंदी साहित्य गौरव पुरस्कार 2020 प्राप्त है। अनुरोध है आपसे कि मंच पर अपना स्थान ग्रहण करें। हमारे साथ हैं मीनाक्षी एफ पॉल। आप हिमाचल प्रदेश विश्वविद्यालय शिमला के सांध्य अध्ययन विभाग में अंग्रेजी की प्रोफेसर और प्राचार्य हैं। आपने 11 पुस्तकों का लेखन एवं संपादन किया है। आप कविताएं लिखती हैं और आपकी पुस्तक किडलिंग फ्रॉम द टेरेस्ट फील्ड से आपकी कुछ कविताओं का उपयोग भारत और विदेश में लिंग संवेदीकरण के लिए किया गया है। She has also translated short stories by acclaimed authors such as Krishna Sukti, Premchand, Jogendra Paul, and S.R. Harnett. Her book of translation, Short Stories of Himachal Pradesh, brings together a collection of stories by Himachali writers. I request you to kindly grace the stage, Meenakshi ji. हमारे साथ हैं मोहम्मद जमन अजरुदा। आप कश्मीरी और उर्दू के विशिष्ट लेखक हैं। कश्मीरी में आपकी 15 से भी अधिक पुस्तकें प्रकाशित हैं। He joined Kashmir University as lecturer and worked as head of Kashmiri department, and later became the professor and head of Urdu and dean faculty of arts, Kashmir University. He is the recipient of Sahitya Akademi Award, JNK Academy of Art, Culture and Language, Ghalib Award. He retired as Dean, Faculty of Arts and Head Department of Urdu, University of Kashmir. Sir, आपसे अनुरोध है कि प्लीज मंच पर आएं और अपना स्थान लें। The next speaker in line is N. Kalyan Raman. आप अंग्रेजी में समकालीन तमिल कहानी तथा कविता के अनुवादक हैं। पिछले 25 वर्षों में आपने अशोक मित्रन, देवी भारती, कुमारी, पेरुमल, मुरुगन, वासंती और शर्मा जैसे महत्वपूर्ण लेखकों की तमिल कथाओं को 13 खंडों में अनुवादित किया है। In 2017, he received the prestigious Pudumai Pithan Award for his contribution to the cause of Tamil literature through his translations. I request Raman sir to kindly take the stage. हमारे अगले स्पीकर हैं सुधाकरन रमनपल्ली. He has been working as editor and coordinator, National Saint Poet Kanakadasa Research and Study Center. He has translated literary works for Sahitya Akademi, Kuberpu Bhasha Pratikara and Kanakadasa Research and Study Center. आपको मंगलम उपन्यास पुरस्कार, नाना स्क्रीन प्ले अवार्ड और अन्य साहित्यिक प्रतिष्ठित अवार्ड मिल चुके हैं। अनुवाद के लिए कर्नाटक साहित्य अकादमी पुरस्कार भी प्राप्त है। आपसे अनुरोध है कि कृपया मंच पर आएं। मंच की शुभकामनाएं। हम चाहेंगे कि सबसे पहले हम इस सत्र के अध्यक्ष महोदय का अभिनंदन करें मंच पर। तो मैं अनुरोध करूंगी मोहम्मद जमन अजरुदा साहब से कि वो हमारे अध्यक्ष इस सत्र के चेयर रंजीत घोषपुरे जी का अभिनंदन करें। और आप होस्ट जी, मैं आपसे अनुरोध करूंगी कि आप जितने भी प्रतिष्ठित पैनलिस्ट डिग्रीज हमारे साथ मंच पर उपस्थित हैं, आप उन्हें अंग वस्त्र देकर उनका अभिनंदन करें। अंजना संधीर जी, अच्छा पहले आप सर करते हैं। मोहम्मद जमन नजरुल्लाह, अंजना संधीर जी, सुधाकरण डॉक्टर जी, सुधाकरण डॉक्टर जी, आप तालियां आई थिंक बजा सकते हैं। एंड कल्याण रमन सर, so we started a little late due to some technical glitch. Session is till 12 और अनुरोध करेंगे कि इसे हम 12 बजे तक अगर कंक्लूड कर पाएं तो here on I would request Host sir to take it forward. So mic is there. Either you want to speak from there. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much for these words of welcome, and it's really both a pleasure and a privilege to be discussing this subject. Thank you for being here this morning. Because too often translation tends to get taken for granted. Those of us who practice it know that this is the case. It is a under-regarded, often unacknowledged practice. But especially in a country like ours, which thrives on pluralism, on diversity, on its sheer heterogeneity, translation is not just another literary practice. I would say that it actually is the lifeblood of this nation. And if we don't acknowledge the work of translation, if we normalize it and take it for granted, we actually forget how much cultural labor is involved in this, in the act of keeping together people who otherwise are quite dissimilar and even divergent. And this is why I think translation also has this very, very strong social and political dimension. It's not something that can be undertaken in a purely aesthetic spirit, if anything can be undertaken in that spirit. Because, I mean, we all know this, but I just want to flag some of these themes as we begin. And I'm going to invite each one of our distinguished panelists today to speak from their own practice and their thoughts. But I just want to say that, you know, when we characterize India as all our usual formula for the nation, the idea that it's unity, diversity, and so on and so forth, there are three ways in which this can play out. When you have different states, different language groups, different forms of ethnicity and religion and so on, we can all be together in a state of mutual indifference. You know, we accept that other people are different from us, and we take that for granted and don't care very much about it. It's very unhelpful as an attitude. The second possibility is that we can all be mutually antagonistic. We each claim that we are who we are because we're not the other. And that is not only unhelpful, it's actually dangerous, and that has too often been the case in the subcontinent. Cataclysmic results. So the third, I think, is the only serious possibility, where each group is curious about the other. You want to know what it is that informs the culture of the other. What does another language mean? What sort of imagination does another language have? And how might you embrace it? And that is the only reality we have ever had in this country for thousands of years. It's been a multilingual, polyglot subcontinent. People have often used multiple languages. Today, we tend to identify ourselves with the one language that seems to be our mother tongue. The further back you look in time, the more you find that people have been functional and at a high level in various languages. So just take the example of Braj Bhasha, because that's one of my favorite examples. You find that the culture of Braj was everywhere across the subcontinent. Sometimes too often in the state where I live, in Maharashtra, there has been a slight tendency to characterize the culture as quite separate from the north. But when you look back at, say, the court of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, he had a Braj court poet who actually wrote a poem in praise of the ruler called the Shiv Bhushan. So you're looking at an early modern court, the court of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, where there were poets active in multiple languages, including Braj Bhasha. Braj went down into the Deccan. It was found in Golconda. It's everywhere. And I'm just picking one language out of many, many languages. So this has been the reality. And each of these languages then encountered other groups and provoked translation. And that's the way we understood one another in this subcontinent. And that's one set of thoughts that I would like us to keep in mind. The second set of thoughts has to do with how, when we think about translation, we're still trapped in this idea that it is about translating the Deshi Bhashas into English or into German, into some seemingly dominant international language. There are two problems with this. One is that we are always imagining that the locus of recognition is somewhere else. And it's marvelous that many of our writers are now receiving that kind of recognition. Gitanjali Shree's book, Great Samadhi, which is absolutely brilliant and innovative in Hindi, through Daisy Rockwell's translation, it now has received the International Booker Prize, which is excellent for the writer and the translator. It's a great honor. But I think when we look at that, we need to ask ourselves several questions. First, of course, it's marvelous. We are receiving this kind of international recognition. But are we doing enough within the country to translate among or between the Desh Bhashas? And I think that question also draws on a history of early 20th century translations, as between Bangla and Gujarati, or Bangla and Marathi, for instance, or Kannada and Tamil, Malayalam and Tamil. There are many of these intra-national translations, which I would really think we need to think about this, because this is equally, if not more, vital to how we think about these questions. And then how do we acknowledge translations and translators in these encounters? I think the Sahitya Academy has always been in the forefront of this, not always recognized or acknowledged in what it's done, but it's done it consistently since for many, many decades now. Yeah. And then the third set, another set of questions that I have here have to do with a responsibility towards languages that are endangered. This is not a simple question. We know that within the subcontinent, especially in the islands and archipelagos, there are languages which now have between 1 and 3 speakers left at all, taking particularly the Andaman archipelago. And this is something that is happening across the subcontinent. And it's conventional to claim that this is because of English. Good old English gets blamed for this. But I think there are other factors that are at play. Whenever you try to impose a standardized language, dominant language, whether it's English or Hindi or whatever it might be, you actually place these other endangered languages that sometimes don't have scripts necessarily, you're placing them under pressure. You're also characterizing them as dialects, in some cases, peripheral languages. How do we bear witness to those languages? How do we make sure that their literatures don't disappear? That is, I think, the ethical responsibility. There's no simple answer to how this is to be done, but that's something I would flag. If it comes up later in the discussion, this will be hopefully a good thing. And to be aware that within each of our dominant major Desh Bhashas are other languages that have been absorbed into. Again, I think of Hindi, which, as we all know, is not a simple language. It's a language continuum which is absorbed Bhojpuri, Marathi, Braj, Magahi, and at least 15 other languages. How do we retain not just the flavor in an aesthetic sense, but how do we retain the experience of writing and being in these other languages? So these are relatively more complex questions, but I do hope that we'll address them in the course of today. So What I'm going to do now is to invite each of our panelists to share their thoughts and experiences. And we are aware of the clock, so there are maybe 8 to 10 minutes of presentations. And I'm going to invite you to start, and then we'll go around, and then we'll come back and have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then ask all of you to join us as well.
आदरणीय मंच और विद्वत श्रोतागण, आप सबको प्रणाम करती हूँ। और हम जिस तरह से कोटा जी ने कहा, बहुत सारी भाषाओं के अनुवाद के बाद मैं आपको अनुवाद के थ्रू क्या मैंने किया और क्या उसका परिणाम आया उसके बारे में कुछ बताना चाहूंगी। मेरी लाइफ है वो हिंदी, अंग्रेजी, गुजराती, और मैं जन्म से पंजाबी हूँ और भाषा हिंदी रही, उर्दू रही, और ट्रांसलेशन में ये चारों पांचों भाषाएं हैं, काम करते रहे। पंजाबी को फिर बाद में निकलना पड़ा और उर्दू को भी रफ्ता रफ्ता छोड़ना पड़ा, लेकिन 3-4 भाषा मैंने से हिंदी में ट्रांसलेशन किया, हिंदी से उर्दू में ट्रांसलेशन किया, गुजराती से 17 इंपॉर्टेंट भाषाओं का अनुवाद किया, और गुजराती से बहुत सारा साहित्य हिंदी में आया। तो उससे क्या हुआ कि बहुत सारा लोगों तक पहुंचा, क्योंकि मेरा ऐसा मानना है कि जब तक हमारे अच्छे लिटरेचर की बात दूसरे लिटरेचर तक ना पहुंचे तो बहुत फैलती नहीं। आज अनुवाद की बात हो रही है, देखिए गीतांजलि जी को कितना प्यार मिल रहा है, इसलिए कि वो हमारी किताब जो है किसी भाषा में गई है, उसको बुकर अवार्ड मिला। तो जब तक हमारा लिटरेचर दूसरों तक नहीं जाएगा तो संस्कृति उसके साथ नहीं जाएगी। मेरी लाइफ कुछ ऐसी रही कि मैंने 10 साल इंडिया में रही, 15 साल अमेरिका में रही, कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाया, और उसके बाद में वहां से वापस मेरी माँ पंजाबी बोलती थी, मेरे बच्चे अंग्रेजी बोलते थे, तो वो लोग एक ही रूम में बैठते थे और मेरे वेट करते थे कि मैं जब आऊंगी तो मैं पंजाबी को अंग्रेजी में ट्रांसलेट करूंगी और अंग्रेजी को पंजाबी में ट्रांसलेट करूंगी और वो बात करेंगे। तो आप सोचिए कितना मुश्किल। तो एक दिन डिसाइड किया, कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी की नौकरी छोड़ दी, और मैं मेरे छोटे 2 बेटियां हैं मेरी, उन दोनों को लेकर इंडिया वापस आ गई। लोग यहाँ से वहां जाने की बात करते हैं, लेकिन मैंने अमेरिका की कोलंबिया छोड़ी, नौकरी छोड़ दी। उसके बाद में यहाँ आई तो यहाँ पर लोग बोलते हैं कि क्या पागलपंथी है तुम्हारी, व्हाई यू केम बैक टू इंडिया, व्हाट इज देयर। ऐसे मुझे सुकून से जीना है, मैंने जितना पैसा कमाया, नाम कमाया, सब कमाया, लेकिन मेरे बच्चे मेरी माँ के साथ बोल ही नहीं सकते, तो फिर मेरी पढ़ाई लिखाई का क्या फायदा। सो आई जस्ट लेफ्ट। तो ये सिर्फ मैंने आपको बताया ग्राफ कि पहले 10 साल जो ट्रांसलेशन किया, अमृता प्रीतम जी की किताब मैंने ट्रांसलेट की जब मैं 16 साल की थी, स्वराज और विलांग में स्वर्गीय आशरानी वोरा जी की किताब का ट्रांसलेशन किया। मेरा स्पेशल पेज चलता था, मैं गुजराती भाषी नहीं हूँ लेकिन मैंने गुजराती में बहुत काम किया है। तो वो मेरे नवीनारी करके मेरा 85 से 95 का जो मेरा दौर है वो ट्रांसलेशन में यहाँ चल रहा। उसके बाद मैं अमेरिका गई। अब अमेरिका जाने के बाद जो हुआ उसका मैंने 1998 में 1998 में मैंने फॉरेन स्टूडेंट्स को क्रेडिट के हिसाब से हिंदी पढ़ाना शुरू किया। तो मुझे ऐसा होता था कि मेरी भाषा को मैं कैसे लोगों तक पहुंचाऊं, क्योंकि उन्होंने तो आज तो देखिए आपके पास इंटरनेट है, आपके पास व्हाट्सएप है और इतनी सारी वेबसाइट्स हैं, लेकिन 95 में मैं अमेरिका गई थी और वहां पर कुछ नहीं था और गाने भी नहीं थे, सीरीज नहीं थे, कुछ नहीं थे। तो मैं अपने इंडिया से ले जाती थी। तो जब मैंने पढ़ाना शुरू किया तो फॉरेन के स्टूडेंट्स को उन्होंने कभी हिंदी सुनी नहीं थी, सब टाइटल की कभी कोई फिल्में आती थी। मैंने प्रिंसटन यूनिवर्सिटी में पहला शुरुआत की, तो मैंने साउथ एशियन डिपार्टमेंट में पूछा कि हमारी इंडिया की कोई फिल्में हैं, तो बोले कि या यू कैन कम, वी हैव चाइनीज एंड नो। आई सेड नो, आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट इंडिया। आपको सुनकर ताज्जुब होगा कि वहां पर सिर्फ एक फिल्म थी और वो थी बैंडेड क्वीन। बैंडेड क्वीन हमारी उसमें थी। व्हाट, यू डोंट हैव मदर इंडिया, यू डोंट हैव दिस, वी हैव ओनली दिस। ये समय था जब मैंने पढ़ाना शुरू किया। उसके बाद मैंने गीतों के माध्यम से हिंदी कैसे पढ़ाई जाए वो मैंने काम किया। 100 साल पहले मुझे तुमसे प्यार था, आज भी है और कल भी रहेगा। 2 लाइन है और उसमें 3 काल आते हैं। जब उनको टेंस पढ़ाते हैं, हमारे यहाँ के बच्चों को भी टेंस पढ़ाना हो तो मुश्किल होता है, वो लोग तो टेंस जानते भी, तो 2 लाइन में 3 काल आते हैं, वो जान जाते हैं कि ओ ये पास्ट, have is present, gone is future। 15 मिनट के अंदर फिर वो गाना है ना, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13, 15 मिनट में दे लर्न हिंदी। 30 तक की गिनती 15 मिनट में वो सीखते हैं। ये क्या हुआ, कैसे हुआ, कब हुआ, क्यों हुआ, ये जो क्वेश्चन के जितने भी सवाल हैं वो उस गाने में आते हैं। क्या हुआ, कब हुआ, कैसे हुआ। और मैंने फिल्मी गीतों के मेरा कल्चर में कैसे मेरी जबान लोगों तक पहुंचा हूँ, वो मैंने जो काम किया मैंने एंजॉय किया, इसलिए वो काम हुआ। एक्चुअली सीरियसली काम होता तो कुछ मेरी क्लासों में दूसरे सेशन के बच्चे आते थे, वो बोलते कैन यू जॉइन इन योर क्लास। मतलब मेरी क्लास में तुम लोग हिंदी के स्टूडेंट क्यों आते हो? बोले योर क्लास इज सो लाइव यू नो। तो उसमें गाने चलते हैं, उनमें ढूंढ के गाने लगा दी थी और फिर उनको मैं खुद ही गाती थी और उनको बता दी थी कि ये ऊपर बोर्ड पे लगा देती थी कि ये खाते थी खाएगी गाएगी, ये पूरा ग्रामर है हिंदी का, ठीक है। ये क्वेश्चन वाले वर्ड है, क्या हुआ, कैसे हुआ, कब हुआ। तो उसमें से एक बार क्या हुआ कि हमारी फिल्म कोलंबिया में आई, तो कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी में आने के बाद क्या हुआ कि हमारी तमाशा संस्था चलती है साउथ एशियन, और उनमें से मेरे स्टूडेंट कुछ डांस करने वाले थे। उन्होंने मुझे कहा कि मैम यू विल कम, वी आर गोइंग टू प्रेजेंट इन इंडिया। बोला ठीक है। मैं वहां गई, दूसरे दिन क्लास में विद्यार्थी बोलते मैडम हाउ वाज आवर डांस। मैं कहा हाँ तुम्हारा डांस तो अच्छा था। तो बोले कि हाउ वाज द शो। बोले शो बहुत अच्छा था लेकिन हमने रिप्रेजेंट किया इंडिया। आई सेड नो नो यू डेफिनेटली डिड नॉट रिप्रेजेंट इंडिया, यू आर वेयरिंग क्लब सॉन्ग, you are singing club song, you are what you are wearing। वो बोले क्यों। अब जो सवाल मैं बताने जा रही हूँ कि उन लोगों को ये मालूम नहीं है कि कोई बंदा, जैसे आपने जितने भी विद्वानों ने देखा होगा कि तमिलनाडु जो है वहाँ के जो लोग हैं उनको मालूम नहीं है कि ये बंदा मर गया है तो ये गाना नहीं लगाना चाहिए, भजन लगाना चाहिए। वो लगा देते हैं so that they can have their शांति उसकी आत्मा को मिले। तो उन्होंने कहा कि why don't you write a book। तो मैंने ये किताब लिखी, लर्न हिंदी एंड हिंदी फिल्म सॉन्ग्स। ये देखिए, और ये किताब मैंने लिखी फिल्मी गीतों के माध्यम से कैसे पढ़ाना। और मेरा शो चलता था लर्न हिंदी एंड हिंदी फिल्म सॉन्ग्स। हफ्ते में 10 मिनट का शो होता था और उसमें 40 मिनट बेल बजते थे कि अगले हफ्ते ये गाना बजाइएगा, वो गाना बजाइएगा। तो इस तरह से ये तो फिर न्यूयॉर्क लाइफ इंश्योरेंस कंपनी, उन्होंने इस कमर्शियल पीपल, उन्होंने बोला कि हिंदी के प्रोग्रेस के लिए उन्होंने इस किताब को पिकअप किया। 10,000 बुक्स एंड सीडीज। देखिए एचएमवी वालों ने इस सीडी को रिलीज किया, उस समय गाने नहीं थे और ये उनका लोगो है। ये आप देखिए, ये न्यूयॉर्क लाइफ इंश्योरेंस कंपनी ने इस किताब को लॉन्च किया और दिवाली के दिन मुझे बुलाया, बोले वी आर अंजना जी, वी आर होस्टिंग दिस बुक फॉर द प्रमोशन ऑफ हिंदी। व्हाट ए ड्रीम कम ट्रू। आप सोचिए विदेश में जाकर आप अपनी भाषा को दूसरी तक ले जाएं। मेरा रेडियो शो में मैं हफ्ते में एक ही गाना बजा दी थी, लास्ट में 3 वर्ड देती थी, नमस्ते, इसको शुभ रात्रि को इंग्लिश में ये बोलते हैं, शुभ रात्रि, गुड नाइट, जैसे 3 वर्ड। ये एक प्रमोशन था। इसमें मैंने हिंदी गाना तो लिखा, उसको रोमन में लिखा, उसके बाद में उसका ट्रांसलेशन आता था। तो ये एक छोटा सा काम मैंने किया जो बहुत बड़ा हो गया और अमेरिका में इसका आंदोलन शुरू हुआ। लोग कहने लगे कि अरे हमने इतने पैसे कमाए पर हमारे बच्चे तो भाषा ही नहीं जानते, और हिंदी की शुरुआत हुई। वहां पर लोग अपनी अपनी भाषाओं को भी मंदिर में सिखाने लगे कि नहीं अरे मेरा बच्चा तो बांग्ला नहीं जानता, ये नहीं जानता, वो नहीं। तो ये छोटा सा काम बहुत बड़ा हो गया। तो मैंने अनुवाद के बहुत सारे काम किए। देखिए एक तो ये एक यूनिक काम हुआ। वापस मैं इंडिया आई, यहाँ आने के बाद मैंने बहुत सारे काम किए, 17 किताबें मैंने ट्रांसलेट की। उसमें आप देखिए कि ट्रांसलेशन से सबके नाम दिखा पाना मुश्किल है। कृष्णायन किताब है, ये गुजराती की बेस्ट किताब है, 6000 से ज्यादा इसकी तो गुजराती में जा चुकी है। इसको मैंने ट्रांसलेटेड किताब जो है वो एक ही साल में दूसरा एडिशन आना मुश्किल होता है, लेकिन इसका दूसरा एडिशन आया। और लोगों का ये कहना है कि ये किताब काजल जी ने, काजल ओझा वैद्य फेमस राइटर है गुजराती की, कि उन्होंने ये किताब लगता नहीं कि गुजराती में लिखी है, किताब हिंदी में लिखी गई है। उसके बाद मैंने भूकंप और भूकंप, ये भूकंप और भूकंप किताब है सर, ये डिजास्टर के ऊपर किताब है। और ये गुजरात में जो सदी के शुरुआत में जो डिजास्टर आया, उसमें हमारे 17 राइटर्स जो हैं उन्होंने इसके ऊपर कहानियां लिखी हैं, और उन कहानियों को मैंने ट्रांसलेट किया। और अभी इसका मराठी में स्पेशली, अगर आप लोग मराठी जानते हो, हमारे मासी बैठे होंगे यहाँ पर, तो ये मराठी का स्पेशल इशू आया। ये डिजास्टर क्वारंटाइन, क्योंकि कोविड आ गया तो क्वारंटाइन वर्ड राजेंद्र सिंह बेदी जी की किताब के अंदर ही आ रहा है, उनकी कहानी भी इसमें है। और इसमें मेरी किताब जो है भूकंप, हिंदी साहित्य की ये पहली किताब है जो डिजास्टर की यानी भूकंप के ऊपर लिखी गई है, और भूकंप केंद्रित कहानियां हैं गुजराती के श्रेष्ठ 17 राइटर्स की। तो इसका जो अनुवाद हुआ यहाँ से ये यहाँ पहुंची, यानी मैंने गुजराती से हिंदी में किया, हिंदी से मराठी में आया, उसमें भी इसकी तंबू नाम की कहानी गई है। उसके बाद मैंने जो ट्रांसलेशन मेरे बारे में उन्होंने कहा, नरेंद्र मोदी जी की किताब, मुझे बता दीजिएगा टाइम। So 2 minutes में मुझे फिनिश अप करना है, because I have to say a lot of it, मैं ज्यादा नहीं कहूँगी। नरेंद्र मोदी जी की किताब मैंने ट्रांसलेट की गुजराती से हिंदी में, ये उनकी गुजराती से हिंदी में किताब है, और आज हिंदी के माध्यम से वो 22 भाषाओं में ट्रांसलेट हो चुकी है, और 22 और 2 नेपाली और उसमें भी आ चुकी है। देखिए ये सारी भाषाएं हैं जिनमें वो ट्रांसलेट हो चुकी है। मैंने एक पोस्टर बनाने की कोशिश की, ये गुजराती से पहले हिंदी में आई, और हिंदी से वो इंग्लिश में भी, जो इतने तो बड़े लोगों की किताबें पहले अंग्रेजी में छपती हैं, वो हिंदी में आती है, लेकिन हिंदी से उर्दू में भी है ये किताब। हमारे सिंधी के बच्चे सिंधी पढ़ते नहीं है, अरबिक में तो सिंधी और उसमें अरबिक भाषा में भी है। इस तरह से ये काम हुआ, और पूरे वर्ल्ड में इसके बारे में जो लिखा गया उसके ऊपर से किताब जो आई, दैट इज समीक्षकों की दृष्टि में ये किताब पूरे वर्ल्ड से जो लोगों ने इस किताब को पढ़ा, उन्होंने अपने अपने रिएक्शन दिए, तो उसके ऊपर से एक किताब है एडिटेड बुक। और मैं यहाँ पढ़ाती हूँ, मुझे थोड़ा सा ये बताना है कि अभी जो हमारा जो गया, हम जिस मास्क पहने हुए हैं उसमें मेरे विदेशी बच्चे, क्योंकि मैं पिछले 22 से 25 सालों से फॉरेन स्टूडेंट्स को हिंदी पढ़ाती हूँ और देसी स्टूडेंट्स को, इंडियंस को इंग्लिश पढ़ाती हूँ। तो जब ये लॉकडाउन हुआ उसमें पोलैंड की लड़कियां मेरे यहाँ हिंदी पढ़ रही थी और सब कुछ बंद हो गया। तो मैंने बाद में एक कविता लिखी, दर फिर खुलेंगे, अगर आप 1 मिनट देंगे तो मैं और मैंने वैष्णव जन तो देने के लिए जो हमारा है बहुत बड़ा गीत महात्मा जी का, उसका मैंने गुजराती से हिंदी अनुवाद किया, उसको गाया गया। वैष्णव जन तो वो जानते हैं, आप सब लोग ने सुना होगा, मैंने उसको गुजराती से हिंदी में अनुवाद किया। लेकिन मैं ये बताना चाहती हूँ कि ये 3 बच्चे, मैंने कविता लिखी, दर फिर खुलेंगे हम फिर उड़ेंगे। ये एक कविता होप की थी कि आज तो बंद हो गया, सब कुछ बंद हो गया है। तो ये हमारे 3 बच्चे, उन्होंने मैंने उनको भेजी ये कविता और उनको कहा कि आप अगर हो सके तो हिंदी के साथ आप अपनी भाषा में अगर कर सके। तो उसमें 3 बच्चे, एक ये जापान का है शून्य से, उसने हिंदी में भी पढ़ा, उसका पूरा वीडियो है उसका और वो वायरल हो गया। तो मैंने मेरी ट्रांसलेशन के एक रास्ते से पूरे वर्ल्ड को क्वारंटाइन में जोड़ने की कोशिश की। ये शून्य से है, उसने हिंदी में और जापानी में पढ़ा। ये पोलैंड की लड़की है, बेटा नाइकर, और उसने उसको हिंदी में और पॉलिश में ट्रांसलेट किया और फिर वीडियो बना के मुझे भेजा। और ये लड़का जर्मनी का है। ये जब 12वीं क्लास में था तब वो आया था इंडिया एक्सचेंज प्रोग्राम में, मेरा स्टूडेंट था। तो ये हमारा सीमान बोल्ट है, उसने जर्मनी में ट्रांसलेट किया हिंदी और जर्मनी, और मुझे वीडियो बनाया। तो मैंने नमस्कार के साथ में इसको हिंदी और अंग्रेजी में किया। तो इससे क्या हुआ कि वो इतना पॉपुलर वीडियो हो गया उस तरह कि वो सारी दुनिया में, किसी ने इंस्टाग्राम पे डाला, किसी ने उस पे डाला। उसमें मुझे कहना तो बहुत कुछ है, लेकिन मैं ना कहते हुए कुछ, क्योंकि और भी सब विद्वानों को कहना है, उससे पूछा जाएगा तो कुछ बताऊंगी। मुझे सिर्फ ये कहना है कि भाषा आदमी को जोड़ती है। मैं 7 भाषाएं जानती हूँ, 5 भाषाओं में काम करती थी, अभी 4 भाषाओं में निरंतर काम करती हूँ। सो आई एंजॉय। वेलकम कहना है किसी को या नमस्कार कहना है, तो भाषाओं और अनुवाद, मेनली तो हम अनुवाद की बात कर रहे हैं। मेरी किताब जो है अमेरिका हड्डियों में चल जाता है, उसको मैंने ट्रांसलेट किया, अमेरिका फ्रीजेस इनटू योर बोन्स। और इसके हिंदी में इसके 3 एडिशन आ चुके हैं। गुजरात यूनिवर्सिटी में इस समय वो डायस्पोरा लिटरेचर में जाएगी, और मुंबई यूनिवर्सिटी में वो लगी हुई है। और सिर्फ ये कहना है कि अनुवाद पर आया प्रवेश है। हमने जो लिखा गोइंग इनटू समबडीज सोल, लेकिन अपना कुछ भी एडॉप्ट ना करते हुए उसने क्या कहा उसको ट्रांसलेट करना। और जैसे मैंने नरेंद्र मोदी जी की किताब का किया, बहुत लोगों का ऐसा कहना है कि ये लगता नहीं है कि हम ट्रांसलेटेड बुक पढ़ रहे हैं। तो ट्रांसलेटेड बुक नहीं पढ़ रहे, यही उसका रिवॉर्ड है। और इसी तरह से वो बहुत जगह गई। तो मेरी जो किताब थी उसका तेलुगु में भी अनुवाद हुआ बहुत। और अमेरिका में एक गुजराती के राइटर हैं, उनको भरत त्रिवेदी, चक्रव्यूह करके उनकी किताब थी, जिसका मैंने गुजराती से हिंदी अनुवाद किया। वैष्णव जो मैंने आपको बताया, वो अभी हमारे गुजरात विद्यापीठ की जो वेबसाइट है उसके ऊपर आप चाहेंगे तो सुन सकते हैं। तो ज्यादा ना कहकर मुझे दिखाना था, इसलिए मैंने भाषण देना मुझे आता भी नहीं है। जो काम किया वो आप तक पहुंचाया। कुछ गलती हो माफ कीजिए। नमस्कार।
Thank you so much. I'm not going to improvise on the order, and did I mention? It's interesting, as you were speaking, Ajnaji, it just struck me that the etymology of the word anuvad suggests to be constant, to speak in a manner of consonants. Because it's, if you consider what the opposite is, it's prativad, which is a monetaristic. So again, the word itself has these connotations of seeking the other and trying to produce harmony. So make your presentation.
I'm happy to be here for Auditorium panel discussion on uniting cultures through translation. I have a few things to say about this concept, and some of it might strike you as a bit dated, but there it is. You requested me. First, I would like to begin with stating what the function of literature and therefore translated literature is purported to be. And no one can put it more fittingly than Susan Sontag, the great thinker, American thinker, who said that translation mirrors and duplicates the role of literature itself, which is to expand our sympathy, educate the heart and mind, to create inwardness, and finally to secure and deepen the awareness that people different from us really coexist. I mean, this is one of the great things about translation. When a text is transported from one language and culture to another language and culture, it makes the host language and culture aware of where the text originated from and what the how human beings live in that culture. But literature therefore promotes empathy and understanding towards people different from us. For the because the world we encounter in literary works is inhabited by people who are irreducibly human. We know that that life, imagined or real, happens in specific geographies, in specific cultures, uh, and in specific historical moments. But the point is that what we get out of a literary work is that we go beyond all these things to empathize with the humans who inhabit that literary work. I mean, this is what I feel we do. This is a fundamental experience of literature as it happens. And this is what literature has to offer us. If we read Dostoevsky, for instance, we don't, of course, we do learn about 19th century Russia, its landscape, its belief systems, culture, and so on. But what we are deeply engaged with is the characters and how they respond to the human condition, how they respond to the enduring predicaments of human life. So I would say that all stories are told in the spirit and they are received in this spirit. So this being the case, what does the concept of uniting cultures through translation actually means? Or how can translation function as a mode of social intervention? Okay. So this is very different from the basic literary experience. So I would like to explore this over the next few minutes. Now, undeniably there have been many instances actually of translation having a great social impact. But I would like to, for my purposes, I would like to refer to just four of them, spanning a long period of time, and highlight a few features of this impact. The first is the transliteration of Valmiki Ramayana into by Kamban, a Tamil poet in the 12th century, into Kamban Ramayana, which is one of the greatest works of Tamil literature that we celebrate. And then in the 14th century, there was also a translation of Mahabharata in Tamil language. It is called Liliputtula Bharatam, after the poet. Now the impact of these, although the Tamil community, the Tamil people were aware of the great epics, the two great epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, right from the Sangam period, there are references to it, and it also percolated into the subaltern classes. I mean, they had ways of celebrating the epic. The first time that Tamil came to own this text is through Kamaramayana, and similarly Veliputtara. And therefore, it kind of not so much in a theological sense, but in the culture, but in the epic culture sense, Tamils came to, it had an impact on the life of Tamil, and it continues. By epic culture, what I mean is what Ashish Nandi says. He says that epics are a way of building a past outside history. They provide you paradigms for living, paradigm or at least reflecting on your predicaments. And this is something that we know that Ramayana and Mahabharata do, in our society. So this is one instance of impact. Now and it percolated to the subaltern classes, and they had different ways of engaging with the epic, the dance form called and so on, and also discourses, popular discourses. Now the thing is that some people might say that this emotional integration of the subaltern classes into the epic culture is good in a way, but it's also not such a good idea to integrate them so powerfully into a power structure which is, which is rife with discrimination and exploitation. So this is, but that's another story. But the impact was certainly there. The first-hand impact was certainly there. The second instance of translation having a major impact is how in the 15th century, the verses of Kabir Das and similar poems, contemporary poems, they were translated over a period of time from the original Bhojpuri to Rajasthani, to Punjabi, to Gujarat and Kutchi, which is a dialect, and so on. And these were done at the grassroots level by troops of ignorant singers, and they've been kept alive until today. And of course, we all know that some verses of Kabir Das and Ramdas were incorporated in the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the holy text of the. So the popularity of these enduring popularity of these verses and the incorporation into the Guru Granth Sahib, they keep alive the possibility of harmonious living among people of different faiths. That the verses and teachings of Kabir and other saints help the spread of the Sanskrit culture across North India that promoted coexistence rather than conflict is beyond question. And these developments are actually autonomous from the power structures of the day. They didn't require their patronage, and they didn't, they happened among the people because there was a felt need among the people to give expression to this kind of belief that to live together, that there is no difference between different gods and so on. And that it gave them a spiritual vantage from which is very powerful, to practice this coexistence in the material world. Now the third is the production of the King James Bible in the 17th century, the authorized version, sponsored by the king, and it had this wonderful, great powerful impact of, first of all, strengthening the Church of England as an autonomous body, and establishing England as an independent Christian nation. And also the King James Bible is one of the most influential texts in the history of mankind. And so it basically what it did was to what existed in other languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Greek, and so on. What it did was what the translation was an effort to own that text and make it their own, and be animated by that spirit. So it's again it's the same thing as Kamba Ramayana in some way, and therefore is powerful. The fourth example is what happened in India during the the first half of the last century, when the freedom movement was going on, and there was a need, a political need to actually spread the message of nationalism, and this was carried by the leadership of the freedom movement. And in order to support that, a lot of translation work happened, between Indian languages, not only of texts that Gandhi and other people produced, but also of Bankim and Charan Chandra and Tagore and Premchand and so on. In fact, Premchand's Seva Sadan was actually translated to Tamil and made in the late 1930s. So this translation supported the evolution of a national consciousness, and also the exchanges, so that you understood that you were going to, and you also had an emancipatory dimension, because the freedom movement, aspired to, or the nationalist movement aspired that you had an emancipatory dimension. You wanted to reform certain practices which are mainstream in Hindu society. So such works were translated and spread. I mean, the popularity was quite high. Speaking as a Tamil, I can say that the popularity of translated works from other Indian languages was particularly Marathi, Malayalam, and Bangla. It's very, very high. So there is in all these four instances, there is one common feature, which is that a propagation of a powerful idea in response to social and political needs. And that's why they were successful. And then the second thing, the sponsors were usually people who wield power, like the king or people who led a movement or and things like that. Except for Kabir, which was somewhat different. But you can say that the masses of people were also with power in society. Usually they don't, but in this instance they did. So this is so essentially what the reception of translation, the politics of the time is very important. The political need of the time is very important as far as reception of translation is concerned. I mean, it has a huge impact on it. Now we come to contemporary India. In contemporary India, the first 2 decades of independence, national integration was a priority campaign of the state, because suddenly you constituted the republic, and you need to sort of get people acquainted with one another, as it were. I mean, which is an endless process. But so there was a conscious effort to translate literatures from between Indian languages, language to other languages. And by the way, the Sahitya Academy also was founded in 1954, and it's one of its main programs was this translation program of literatures from Indian languages across cultures and languages. So Sahitya Academy has been doing it diligently, I mean, over the years, and even today it continues to do so. But as the republic attained a certain kind of maturity and stability, because for instance, this national integration was achieved through other means. It was achieved through the army, institutions, central government, and various cinema and various other means. Through literary translation, the role of literary translations kind of came down. So people developed a stake in the nation in other ways. Okay. Not so much through understanding, maybe through self-interest or whatever, but they certainly did, and therefore automatically the political need for literary translation kind of vanished. Not vanished, but it kind of came down. And then there was another reason for it also. Since independence, the local cultures. By local culture, I mean, especially in the major languages, they began to assert themselves. And it was a period of enormous innovation and flourishing of literatures in various major Indian languages. Certainly in the South Indian languages, and probably in Marathi, Malayalam, Hindi, and so on. And therefore, again, the attention that would be paid to literary works translated from other languages, it came down because they were more busy in constructing this literary value, so to speak. And there were many contentions and many debates that had settled each literary culture, each major language. And therefore it came down. So you find that through the 20th century, especially after 1970 or so, the public interest or public awareness in translations, it came to be what it was. It came to be much reduced than what it was earlier. This is the way it happened. But translations continue to be produced and continue to be there. But in a very aesthetic sense, rather than with any political content.
Now, after about 4 decades of independence, there was also the new development came where we had generations of although Indians started writing fiction in English right in the 30s and so on, but in the 80s and 90s, there were generations of Indians who aspired to write fiction in the original English. Okay, because they thought that English was their language. I mean, our education system kind of pushed people into a kind of monolingual Anglophones, as it were. And so there was a tremendous amount of, they had their things to say, and there was a tremendous amount of national and international attention directed to it. And there was this, the genre of Indian writing in English was formed. And for understandable reasons, it attracted a lot of attention and so on. And English translation, which started again, I think it started with P. Lal's Writers' Workshop. I mean, that was the earliest efforts of widespread English translation. And then it kind of received a fillip because if Indian stories could be told in English, then they could be translated into English as well. I mean, there was a impetus for English translation of literature from Indian languages, and therefore, over the past 30 years, we've seen a considerable amount of works being, in fact, all the major works of all the major writers, I think, most of them have been translated into English as they're available in English. But the thing is that English translations have become an adjunct to this rather flashy and rather prominent genre in writing in English. So this is, now here is where, and there is another thing which is happening in the local cultures in Tamil, for example, or Malayalam, or anywhere else, is that the people who did not belong to the mainstream literary milieu, which is basically dominated by the upper caste, they were the people in the subaltern classes. They started entering the mainstream. Dalits and others, and fishermen and so on. Now, they translated themselves into the mainstream, okay, and they became part of the mainstream literary milieu in each of the languages. I mean, there's a significance to that which I'll talk about. Now, at this point, I would like to remind that the reception of translations come into a world of hierarchies. That is clear. When we celebrate the fact that Daisy Rockwell's translation of the Hindi novel Red Samadhi won the International Booker Prize, and that in all these years, it was the first time that a literary work from an Indian South Asian language was recognized. All that. There is a reason for this, and the reason also has been written about in the sense that in the Western world, they are more receptive to translation from European languages, from Spanish and from Italian and so on, French, Portuguese and so on. So there may be reasons for it that you and I may not approve, like racial or geographic or cultural affinity, but it's a fact of life. So this is where we are rudely reminded that apart from everything else that translation is, it is also a mode of seeking attention and accommodation in the home of other people, and the extant conditions in those homes and their propensities will determine how the translations are received. I mean, this is something that I wanted to highlight. Such hierarchies are present in Indian language literatures as well. Like I said, the subaltern literature produced within language milieu, it is there, but it is not on par with the leading writers, what the leading writers produce. Now the thing is that they are not completely shut down because they share the same political space. Okay, and therefore there is space for contention, for interrogation, for for questioning and modifying the concept of literature itself, or how it should function. So, and the people who've been marginalized thus far, they have sort of laid a claim to occupy that space, and they are succeeding in it. Now, this is one part. Now, but when they are translated, what happens into English, for instance, it's a different thing. Now, in the realm of English translation, it can be said in fairness that despite a steady output of over 30 years, this genre has not managed to engender the serious engagement it deserves. The deeper understanding and empathy with other cultures that English translators make possible has not resulted in the forging of solidarities across regions. I mean, that could be one of the societal developments, right? Or in the mitigation of hierarchies, that's all. Evident reasons, basically, according to me, are the absence of serious discourses on the source text in their own context, and the lack of support for this activity. In terms of space, funds, and attention. If you want discourses, then you have to make space for them where they can be expressed and where they can be discussed. So that is something. I mean, apart from the academy, there is really no space for translation to be discussed seriously, and and the works from various languages can be looked at together, and some meaning can be derived out of it. And we are also not incentivizing people who can do it. After all, if somebody has to do it, it has to be worth their while, and that simply is not happening. There's no support for such work. On a scale that needs to be. So what we take away from the discussion is that translations are as a mode of social intervention and work only in the presence of a conducive political climate, and if they are supported and received in an environment that eschews traditional hierarchies and division. This is asking for the moon, but why not? So, so when I come back to uniting cultures through translation, you can do it two ways. One way to do it will be what was done, in the times past, where you propagated an idea that that overrode these cultural differences. Okay, and it was usually politically motivated. Okay, so this can be done, but in the contemporary era, this can be done through cinema or some other means. Okay, even outright political propaganda. So it doesn't have to be done through literature. So, but if we want to really let literature function in the way it should, we have to recognize that translations are about the potential for solidarities and coexistence with due respect for the difference between cultures and between different ways of life. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up on some of the key themes later in the interest of time. But actually, could I invite you to the next? And let me come back to these questions, both of where do we expand the definition of literature, or also this possibility of something actually.
Thank you. So with the permission of the chair, I will not waste any time and not dive right into what I wanted to say. It's going to be a personal kind of a dialogue. Hopefully it will emerge into a dialogue. My first run into translation was in a Katha festival which happened in Delhi some 30 odd years ago. And when I reached there, I was so interested and impressed as a very young lecturer that there was so much literature available from across India and some parts of the world. And I went looking at all the stalls and I did not find one book on Himachal. And that's what really made me think and said, maybe I can try at least to bring out one volume of translation of Himachali literature into English, because that's the only language I am comfortable translating. I know 3 languages. I'm very awed by Anjana Madam's competencies. I only know 3, and one I'm not very fluent in a literary sense. So that left only English and Hindi. But I tried to translate from English into Hindi, though that was not my intention ever, but I failed very miserably. And so I realized that the only language I can translate into is English. It's not my own comfort. And no apologies offered, because after all, we are trying to dismantle the hierarchies of languages. On this, then, I ran into a Polish person who was looking at the stall from the northeast, and he's looking, going through that book, and then he says, "Oh, but I don't understand anything." So I said, "But why not? It's in English." He said, "No, there are too many native words that I can't make sense of them." And so, because those were the days of the glossaries, which we appended to the translations, and he said, "No, but that it spoils the readability or reading of the text. And why can't they simply write a pot instead of writing the native word for it?" So that again sent me to the Institute of Advanced Study, trying to understand the theory of translation and asking people, how to do it, how to do it. And then people said, "No, but we must retain some of the untranslatable cultural words and put them there, because otherwise it's lost." My question is, if the other person doesn't understand it, then anyway it is lost. So what do we do? This is a paradox. But of course, those were immature questions, and I found some answers to them, some I'm still looking for. So when you are reading, the best option is to go to the original. But if you cannot access the original, the second best option is to go for the translation. And then I always advise my students, choose the language, which you can access. Then do not read the original, because it's going to be dissatisfying. Any translation is at best dissatisfying. It never clearly captures the whole of it. In other words, it doesn't carry everything across the bridge, even though there is a bridge. But that bridge is a Himachali wooden bridge. You did your best. Yeah? So you don't carry too much weight onto it. Yeah. So translation for me, therefore, was a personal choice, a very personal way of doing it. So I would not accept any commissioned translations. I would not even look at hierarchies or how important the author is. I would only look at my own state, read my writers, and whichever appeals to me, to my heart. I thought, okay, this is a text I can deal with. So it's very personal. Of course, to my wonderment, the first author that I picked up who really appealed to my heart went on to become a very established writer and wander into Saman and whatever, and we have this other note sitting right here. And so I was told by a very eminent translator, a translator's reputation is as good as the original writer. So if you translate Gitanjali Shri, you are certain to get fame. If you translate a XYZ, your translation may be lost over a period of time. Why? Because people don't know the original writer so much. There is no fame or prestige attached to that writer. So anyway, it didn't matter to me. So I went on doing whatever little I could do with Himachali writers and in the language that I was comfortable in. Little do we realize that the stories that we grew up on, Amar Chitra Katha, or the Puranic stories, they are translations. They are all translations. The Ramayana is a translation. The Bhagavad Gita that we have everywhere in Himachal in the villages are translations. So we are not aware that we are reading Aristotle or Camus or Saussure in translation, because we are
Or Vedas.
Or Vedas, of course. In translation, we're not aware of it. Why? Because the original texts are sometimes not available to us, and sometimes the translation is so accessible, we don't care, because it's still making tremendous sense to us. We grew up on Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. It really spoke to my heart because the orchard was cut down. And in Himachal, trees being cut down is a personal loss to all of us, except the mafia. It doesn't make sense to them. So if we are in the global village, translation is a chat room. It's become a very intimate space. It's not something very academic, I feel, anymore, and you may want to differ. There is also intermediate translation. Yeah, so You Are Anandamurti Sanskar was an excellent book. Very good translation. And when you watch the movie in the original language, without the subtitles, it's an excellent movie. So even the media perhaps does not matter. So when last year, the theme for Translation Day on 30th September was United in Translation, and today we are doing Uniting Cultures through Translation. It looks like uniting is the motif of translation. So how else would we have known Bama or Amber or Bashir? How would we be familiar with Janine? How would we know all this? Even Ghalib. Ghalib is so Persian sometimes. Even though we know a little bit of Urdu, we sometimes need to read the translation so that it makes sense to us. The Tomb of Sand. I was reading, I'm still reading the book, so I can't comment on it. I have chosen to read it in Hindi because it is accessible to me. But I was interested in the two different titles that the English and the French have. And so the English has Tomb of Sand. There is a tremendous debate on whether tomb is equivalent to samadhi. So Red Samadhi, तो tomb से क्या वो पूरा context आ रहा है कि नहीं, क्योंकि जब समाधि अगर उसके बाद आएगी फिर आप क्या करेंगे? So the samadhi is in a context. The samadhi has a resonance. So whether it is coming or not, people are debating it. I have nothing to weigh in at the moment. But the French translation translated it into, I'm not going to read the French, my French is atrocious, but in English, it translates into on the other side of the border, on the other side of the border. And there are so many borders that are being crossed in the book. So when I was thinking about it, I said, yeah, well, it makes sense because French has so many borders. And the US couldn't care less about borders in every which way. Yeah, the whole world seems to be its playground. And so that border wouldn't have made sense in the US translation. So like I was saying, there is politics also attached to, and our context and our understanding of the politics which will weigh in our translations. So if translation is a standalone text, which I really believe in, and it is not part of comparative literature in that sense, unless you are really critiquing the translation, जो रसास्वादन है, वो एक ही भाषा में पढ़ेंगे तो आएगा. उसको 2-3 भाषाओं में पढ़ देंगे तो फिर ये कमी है, ये कमी है, ये कमी है, हाँ, फिर तो हम उसी में रह जाएंगे. So it is better that we, that's my opinion, that we don't do it. And translation is so dissatisfying. Bharnoot ji ka Laal Hota Darakht, I have translated 5 times and I'm still not very happy with the translation. So every time it is included in an anthology, I say, hold on, let me make some changes. And I make the changes, an anthology comes out, then another time somebody says, I want to include it. Say, hold on, there is something wrong with it. Let me fix it. And it never gets fixed. So what does that mean to me? Translation unites through the interplay of cultures that takes place through the translated text. I like to look at it as a leela. It is a leela. और हम रास भी कर रहे हैं, okay? हम रास कर रहे हैं. And we keep changing partners, but Krishna is always there. Is always there. Sometimes I'm Radha, and sometimes I'm just another Gopika, and sometimes I'm Kubja, and I'm the most beautiful of them all. So it is, the meaning comes there. Let's look at it as a play. So if the carrying across is incomplete, so is my Leela with Krishna. It is satisfying, it is life enriching, but the Leela must go on. And therefore, it is infinite. And there's an infinite space for interaction, for interpretation, for connection. And that is why I feel, just like a ma'am mentioned Krishnaya, I am reading it in English. It's a beautiful text. And therefore, translation has proved unites in diversity. I would just like to read, if you will indulge me, sir, a little bit, one poem by Rekha, which is in Hindi and which I have recently translated into English. It is for my unborn daughter. At night, when you smile in your dreams, your face buried in the dark curly hair of your son, your breath inhale him as if he were not a knot of flesh and bone, but a pot of honey. For a lifetime, drop by drop, on my, your, and your ancestors' thirsty, yearning tongues. You do not know, at that very time, a black bulbul quietly rises from the trash pile, my unborn daughter. With her sharp beak probes the folds of my flesh and says to me, hide me here, in this umbrous retreat. The founders pursue me, upset with my being. I must keep alive my soul. I have promised this to that woman who first birthed me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Again, I'll hold my comments for the end, but I hope we talk also about what A.K. Ramanujan used to call telling. That everything we know in versions and in translations. The idea of standard text is actually a very modern chimera, I would say. But I'm not going to hold you up. So let's have to invite you to address us next.
Ladies and gentlemen, sitting on the right.
Just that you are
Go ahead. Not the whole. There's somebody. It does me also. I'm so happy that there are some very good shades of mine at the moment before me. In front of me, I should say. You know, my language is Kashmiri, but I don't want to tax you in my language. Hindi, English, I know a little. I'll be mixing both my broken English as well as my broken Hindi. It is so good a topic that you're trying to see translations through culture or culture through translations. Our country, vast country, is like an abridged edition of the big world book. And when I look at my small Kashmir, it's again a mini edition of this abridged book. We have some 10 languages in Kashmir. And all the time we are translated. All the time we are listening to translations. Had the translation process not been there, I would not be able to talk to my Dogri fellows. They would not be able to talk their people from the same place who know Balti or speak Urdu. We should thank this process of translation. But as our chairman put it in the beginning, that sometimes it was not rated equal with the original. And now I myself feel so much guilty even now when the Anpur translated my book. It was 1985. His name was not put on the main title. I still feel guilty, but that was not my fault. That was the practice. And we have come a long way. Try for it. Strive for it. That now the translator appears along with the author, the main writer. And the wages also, I suppose, are just coming closer. But I tell you, without translation, it wouldn't be able. Nobody would be able to read, to go through, to have an idea of other cultures. But there's a problem. So for culture is concerned, original writer has to wear one culture. The translator has to wear two, and sometimes three if he is going through filter language. And we Indians mostly do translations through filter language. I have translated Kannada Vachanas. Professor Shah to get me out, he was there in that project. I have translated Marathi poems, Marathi fiction, Malayali fiction into Kashmiri. Don't think I have done much, hardly 19, 20 books, and then stray short stories and poems, etc. It's very difficult to go through, hold the culture, and put it in a translation. My friend Nanakate Bhattacharya is here. If he would be there, somebody would offer him a cigarette. The cigarette habits. And even if he translate it into Hindi, that's totally something other than a practice. Then I tell you another problem with the translator is I treat original writer as a feature filmmaker. If he doesn't get a location, he substitutes it. If he doesn't get a character, substitutes it. If his character cannot reproduce a dialogue, he substitutes either the character or the dialogue. If he falls short of time, he drops certain scenes. If he has more time, he puts additional scenes. He's so free. But the translator is like a documentary maker. If he has to take a particular pose of a snake, he might have to wait for 10 years. If he doesn't go by proxy, if he doesn't go to stop, if he is very sincere and very true, so he has to do all. Then there are nuances in each language, cultural nuances. I'll tell you, there's a couplet in Urdu. We have if a man, any person for that matter, addresses his or her beloved, then says, Garam guzarega harfe arzu ustapi nazuk par. Garam guzarega harfe arzu ustapi nazuk par. Nigahe shauq इस मजमून रंगीन को अदा करते हैं. The other man says, समझ ले आपकी आंखों में, अगर समझना है, वही है दिल में, जो मेरी निगाह में. And then the other couplet, the same. हमारे मुंह से निकलवा कि मुद्दा क्या है. समझ ले आपकी आंखों में अगर समझना है, हमारे मुंह से कहेगा कि मुद्दा क्या है. The same state, the same expression, but when you read it in original, it's okay. When you read it in translation, how would the translator differentiate between the three? We were in the morning discussing a couplet of Lalit. हाय हुजूर पशीमा का पशीमा होना. वो आए हैं, वो मेरे कत्ल के क्या जफा की, उसने जफा से तौबा मेरे कत्ल के बाद. हाय हुजूर पशीमा का पशीमा होना. He immediately is repentant. Then there is more in other couplet. वो आए हैं पशीमा लाश पर, तुझे ये जिंदगी था. I said they are similar, but to make a difference in translation to each original is very difficult. I leave this literature because you can't separate language from culture or culture from language. And the literature is main vehicle of carrying the culture, of containing the culture, of living the culture, of expressing the culture. But there are certain things that you can't have the idea how to do. That's why they say translation is to kiss your beloved through somebody else's lips. So many things. It can be either beautiful or painful, not both. And I myself don't mind while translating. Faithfulness. It should be at least as beautiful as it could be there. Readability should be there. If there's no readability, what's the fun of translating? Because we are not translating knowledge yet. We are not translating information. Those who are connected with broadcasting, there was a time, I don't know what happens now. TTI, UNI, our government information departments, they would send the press release in English. Then the concerned news reader had to translate it himself. Because one time what happened, from West Pakistan, they sent some sugar plants, transfer some sugar plants to East Pakistan. Now it was the news reader what to do. He could see the dictionary sugar as well as plant. Then he said in Kashmiri, some people from Kashmir are also here. Yet better to die. News editor came and just embraced him. Well, I have like a magic kind. So, the same man, even in knowledge, we got a book of general science translated from Taraki Urdu Bureau long back, 7th class, into Urdu. Now there was some preparation of oxygen gas in the lab, just demonstration. The poor fellow, he knew the English version he had to translate. The other component in such translation is the target language. He knew the target language also, but the poor fellow did not know the subject. But there also there are 3 elements. So he went to the dictionary. He could not find behave shelf anywhere there was preparation of oxygen gas. He got the bee, he got the eye, he got the shelf. Now do you know how the poor fellow did it? शहर की मक्खियों के छत्ते के रखने की जगह. Now you can imagine what happens to knowledge here. When somebody was talking of Republic, you are a student of philosophy, even in English. It's not, I think, appropriate from Greek or from Latin. Must be certain losses, must be certain gains. It's not without that. But at the same time, there are certain things. Everybody feels proud of his language. Maybe it's Marathi, it's Kannada, it is Malayalam. But we Kashmiris, can we translate or ask someone else to translate? For example, if something burns, there's a smell. If we, in our language, if it is cotton, अगर सूती कपड़ा जल रहा है, उसमें जो बू आती है, उसको हम आमुन कहते हैं. अगर ऊनी कपड़ा जल रहा है, उसमें जो स्मेल आती है, उसको हम कंजुल कहते हैं. अगर चाय जल रही है, उससे जो स्मेल आती है, उसको हम बैकग्राउंड कहते हैं. अगर चावल जल रहा है, उसमें जो स्मेल आती है, उसको हम मुचुन कहते हैं. इस तरह से you have just for one smell, I don't know, maybe other language also have. So at such moments when you translate such things, because you are not translating literature only, you are culture only, you are translating the language. In Urdu, we have so many second person pronouns. To the The same meaning in dictionary. Tum, same meaning. Aap, the same. Huzur, huzuri wala. Janab, janab ali, janab wala. Khudawan. So many. थोड़ा सा balloon bit once like this. झुक के मिल ए दिल सभी से, झुक के मिल ए दिल सभी से, वरना गाफिल एक दिन देख लेना आप से तुमसे तू हो जाए. But it's not that somebody says to everybody, to everybody, Khudawan to everybody. So in languages, culture comes through these synonyms. Culture comes through these substitutes. Culture comes through these terms. And then another thing I will point out one particular thing. If you go to our Lucknow and see a marriage ceremony taking place, tell me Bharat. If you take a scene of Bharat, tell me people, there will be now mere, previously it would be horse. The horse and the groom sitting on it, having a turban and the sherwani, but Sahara also. Then you come to Kashmir and try to describe the same scene. Bharat will be there, Ghoda will be there, turban will be there, but the Sahara will be missing. And I tell you, when you go to Leh, what is the same scene? What's that the same scene? Bharat will be there, other things will be there, but the groom will not be there. Because there it is the groom's uncle who goes to get bride for him, not the groom. So I tell you, when you start thinking about it, that can translate, can be translated, can be transformed. Culture, it is a little. I think it is difficult. But at the same time, it's a compulsion. We can't avoid it for all times. We have to know people. It is better to know the partial than to never know. Even in dresses, even in dishes, they see. I tell you one simple thing. When we talk of feminine beauty, if there are 4 people there before us, one is Chinese, the other is British, one is Indian, say Bengali, then you can imagine what type of pictures, what type of faces, what color, what type of hair, what type of noses come. Actually, what we understand, what comes in our mind, that's the basic thing. Anyway, it is a subject that could be not discussed. Those people who came before me, they talked much. Since I don't know that much English, I can't say that I have understood all that what they said. And that's why I avoided the history, because history they might have spoken a lot. But certain things that came before us, I love she said that this lila or naats or other things that come from one language to another, you have to treat very cautiously. Sometimes your step goes beyond your leg, sometimes you laugh. But I'm so happy that the Academy invited us and provided us such a young chairman for the session who is bright enough. And in the beginning, he talked in such a way that I also got encouraged and could stand before you for such a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Could I invite you to speak? Then after you have spoken, we then open up these questions to the audience.
I'm afraid I won't be able to make the speech, because time constraint. and the audience should also. That's anyway, I have prepared a small note on the topic. I'll just read it as during the 75th anniversary celebrations of our independence, the concept of unification of cultures through translation becomes more relevant and significant. As we always uphold, unity in diversity is the strength of a nation. We have a multilingual and multicultural society which is dynamic and complex. The process of cultural exchanges through oral and written translation have been happening in our country since time immemorial. Our epics Ramayana and Mahabharata were translated into various languages, and a few languages were developed as effective means of communication by this translation, the translation of epics and other ancient texts. Those were rather adaptations or interpretations as such. Some of them attained the status of great independent literary works by their varied treatment of the themes of the epics. Tulsidas, Kamban, Kumaravyasa, Vishwanatha Satyanarayana, Ramanujan Ezhuthachan, and many other poets were not mere translators, they were poets of the highest caliber. A translation or adaptation of literature, of literary works from one language to another, always brought people with diverse cultures close to each other, conveying the concept and message of human values and universal love. As a translator mainly working with the South Indian languages, I have experienced the joy of presenting literary works from one language to another. Translation is, as we are aware, intended to restate in one language what someone else wrote in another language. The translator is under obligation to coordinate his intention with the target reader's expectation so that the product resembles the original work in terms of style and sense. Adaptation is a technique whereby the cultural element is replaced by another which is typical of the receiving culture. In this case, the most important thing is the cultural meaning of the message rather than the words making it up. I have translated 35 works from Kannada to Malayalam language. Though the source language has a very rich literary tradition involving classics from 12th century onwards, an average Malayalam reader is not familiar with what Kannada literature is. My translation of modern classics, Shikara Surya and Shivana Dengura of Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar, and Parva and that too of Dr. S.L. Bhairava, was received by readers and writers in Malayalam alike with great appreciation. We have several monumental works in our regional languages which are not known to another linguistic group. Though people are very much aware of it, this is especially pertaining to Kerala. Though people are very much aware of European, Latin American, and African literature, they do not look into the literature of their neighboring state. This even makes our concept of Indian literature incomplete. How can we speak of a national literature without considering the latest developments in our regional languages? Translation has a great role to play in our society. It is absolutely necessary for the effective and empathetic communication between different cultures. Translation is also essential for social harmony and peace. When you learn a language, it not only involves learning its alphabet, word arrangement, and rules of grammar, but also learning about the specific society's customs and behavior. When learning or teaching a language, it is important that the culture where the language belongs be referenced, because language is very much ingrained in the culture. India, being the richest linguistic nation of the world, has cherished the multilingual and multicultural diversity Our languages play a vital role in preserving the cultural diversity and strengthening the concept of a knowledge society for sustainable development. Similarly, translation plays a dominant role in the cultural diversity, in developing one's competence to have a better understanding of religious and cultural diversity through meaning and expression in any given language. Translation as a discipline creates genuine interest and engagement with culture and society. Translation always helps to understand popular phrases, underlying sentiments, and colloquialisms to establish a true understanding between people speaking different languages. This ultimately will facilitate the unification of culture. And see, some translations in the history of a language will create noteworthy developments in the language. I'll tell you in 2 minutes. Nalapat Narayana translation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables was a milestone in the history of Malayalam literature, and it set off a social reformation of sorts in Kerala in 1940s. Despite being a translation, it gifted Malayalam a new prose style. Literary critic Mrs. Leelavati writes about it. The translation was an extraordinary phenomenon as it prepared the ground of the socialist movement and the communist movement to take roots in Kerala. With its philosophy of human equality, the heart-wrenching tale of the oppressed and the downtrodden left a profound impact in our society. Even the first Chief Minister of Kerala, E.M.S. Namboodiripad, wrote about it. And according to him, this translation of Les Miserables was a great revolutionary event in the history of Kerala. Its influence was both sociological and philological. Nalapattu's translation of Les Miserables changed the course of Malayalam fiction in a big way. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you all for
I'm from Delhi. Translation is beautiful, cannot be fit. It's faithful, cannot be beautiful. It has got an inherent philosophy. Translation, you translate your idea into action. You translate your words into deeds. Think.
Yeah, so we would encourage questions because we
But I
already
think we're
have.
out of time.
Yeah,
But I'm also going to. Okay, that be.
Yeah.
This would really be.
yeah, it has to be a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I just wanted to. What Kalyan did. See, whether the books which are received in the international level, whether that decides on the book which you translate, because in Tamil, you get to know we have standards, we know what to do on this, who are such and such. But when one translation breaks into beyond the such thing about the political and social arena in which the translation gets received. So what happens is that there's a speed for similar kind of you see market decides, whether market decides or whether aesthetics decides. That's what I want to know.
Thank you everyone. It works. You know, I'm from 15 books, let's say, and most of them I've chosen to translate. The choice is mine, but some of them sometimes not. Okay, and as far as I'm concerned, as a translator, I mean, I can talk about the way books are received, but I don't think that has influence on, my choice. My choice depends entirely on my appreciation of it and my appreciation of its potential significance. I'm in no position to actually ensure that the significance is realized. But that is something, that's a chance I take. But it certainly depends on my perception of it. If I think some work is, needs to be translated and needs to go out. And if I really have regard for that work, then I can do it.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for sharing these amazing thoughts, but also images. And I think we carry with us very strong references of what we heard today, whether it was the rickety bridge of translation or the fragrances that challenge us to find new words, or the film music that can be a lesson in drama. I think there's a lot that we heard today, but in conclusion, I would simply share two thoughts. One is that when we discuss translation, I think we are now far away from using the old patriarchal cliches. Yehuda Amichai was a brilliant Israeli poet. Unfortunately, he used to say in translation, oh, it's like kissing a woman in a veil. And then we heard this today. A translation can either be beautiful or faithful. I think we need to question these deep-seated patriarchal biases that inhabit the way we talk about translation and move beyond them, because that's the only way in which we not only refine the way in which we think about these things, but also open up to these questions of generosity, solidarity, hospitality that we just heard. And whether it's a rickety wooden bridge or a cantilever, translation is simply a non-negotiable aspect of our lives. We do it all the time, and we need to be committed to it. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn on that.
Thank you so much. It was indeed an enriching session. Our heartfelt thank you to Ranjit Hospitati, who is the chair, and big thank you to Anjana Sandeep ji, Meenakshi Paul ji, Mohammed Zaman Asrita ji, and Lalanavan ji, and Siddhartha Ramathalli ji. आप सभी का हृदय से आभार. We conclude this session and we shall be here again at 12:30 with another session, and the topic of that session is going to be literary classics of the world in Indian writings. See you around.